Thanks, Peter. I'm just going to share a couple of stories quickly and continue this idea of Holy Spirit. We started last week with Pentecost and that time where we celebrated the birth of the church in the early church in the book of Acts. And as the disciples and all of those gathered around, and people gathered from every nation gathered there in that upper room, and somehow then all of a sudden began to understand one another. As Peter spoke, they began to hear their languages being spoken, and yet they were hearing the others' languages being spoken, yet understanding in their own language. A strange experience, to be sure, this idea of the Holy Spirit. But what I suggested last week, I want to continue with this week, and that was the idea that what was happening there was understanding. And that word understanding has in its roots this idea of holding up. Not simply of you think like I think, and therefore you're right because we're thinking the same together, but instead holding up this possibility of understanding. That when Spirit is present, there is some kind of bridging being done. And that's what I want to continue to play with a little bit today, this idea of Spirit. But the opposite of that is also this idea of wall building, which is very present metaphorically and realistically in our culture right now, and in the world to some great extent. It's not unbelievable. It's not hard to understand why it's there. We're human beings. We like control, we like to feel safe, we like to be comfortable with things being the way we think they ought to be, because that feels safe, it feels comfortable, but it's not really what Spirit is about, what Holy Spirit is about. So what I want to suggest we do is to play with you and think about a bigger way of seeing this idea of Holy Spirit. But to get there, I have to think about how we like to anthropomorphize things. All right, I just want to go and skip back a little bit to the book of Genesis. That wonderful story. There's actually two creation stories. I want to talk to you about the second creation story. And that second creation story is the one where God tells Adam to name this stuff, right? And Adam goes around and names everything, which is quite a formidable feat when you think about how many things had to be named in the world. But when you think about people in the Old Testament time, in ancient Hebrew time, they were trying to figure out, they were coming up with these stories. These stories, we call them pourquoi stories, how come stories, why things are the way they are kinds of stories. And it explains how we have all of these different things. Just as the story of Babel explained why we have so many different languages, just as the story of Pentecost explains why God's love is now universal and invited to everyone, open to everyone who is a part of that. Just the opposite of the Babel story in a sense. These stories tell us something profound about God's presence in the world, about God's reality in the world, about the ground in which we have our being, that there is something there like a thread that connects us, but we are oftentimes not in touch with it because of this need to name things, of this need to objectify things. It goes, and you remember it when you were a child, right? So how many of you had a binky when you were a child? How many of you had a blankie when you were a child? How many of you had a name for your blankie? You know? Bartholomew Beddington, was one of our kids, Tim's one that he liked to name it. He called it Bartholomew. I guess the Beddington had to do with the fact that he slept with it. But our youngest, well, now she's our oldest granddaughter, Molly, of course, has 5. There's Blinky, and I'm going to not remember them all, but it's Blinky, Taggy, Tiny, and Stain. And Stain is named because it was the last one into the family, and it's a silk sort of satiny kind of thing that has this this sort of unidentifiable brown spot on it. And we're not sure what that is, but we just called it Stain, which she kind of likes. Sometimes she would call it Puffy because the stain actually has kind of a cloud-like shape to it. And one time, when they were headed back to the airport, they had this panic as they were driving back to the airport to fly to Germany, and there was this panic. They slammed on the brakes. We just said goodbye. They were down the street. They backed up, racing back. They were going to be late for their flight. Tim came rushing out, and he said, "The gang! I need to get the whole gang. It's Binky, Taggy. They're all missing." And she's screaming in the car. And I'm thinking to myself, it sounds sort of like a mafia gang, sort of a misfit mafia. Tiny, Binky, Stain. Where are they? And of course, you would think that we as parents would know to panic first rather than run the risk that you'd be on a 12-hour flight and your whole security gang, your whole security team didn't make the flight. Or as grandparents, we'd know that that was going to happen. So we did a whole rush through the house in a panic, and we found them exactly where we sometimes would think we'd need them, right? In those moments where we are least secure, in those moments where we are sometimes most afraid, like right before we go to sleep. And so we curl them all up next to us. And sure enough, 3 of them were in her bed, and Stain was in our bed. And we got them back down to her, and as they were getting in the car and gave them to her, the window was down, and I heard Molly looking at the 4 of them going like, "Don't you ever do that again." And I thought, they got personalities and everything, But I think about that. You realize we do this. We still do this. So Brad, what's the name of your guitar? Barbara. What's the name of your van? Clyde. Right? I don't know if you name your cars, right? My current little car, my Mini Cooper, and I don't have a better name for it, but it's red and it's kind of round, and I call it the Little Red Tomato because it's just a little round, squatty, car. And then someone says, "Did you have a thing with VeggieTales, growing up?" And I was like, "I'm not that generation." Do either of you have any names for anything, any of your other stuff? Lori, piano, anything?
My piano is Stella.
Stella. Okay, nice. Anything else? No? Yeah. And so I'm sure probably you've done this as well, right? We find that we name things. We name cars, we name trucks. And if we don't name them, we often refer to them in the feminine or the masculine. Like a guy will say his truck, you look over and say, "This guy, he's bad, man. This guy can do anything. He will cover terrain like a cheetah." He'll talk about his truck that way. Or we'll talk about a car like my old BMW, and my son says, "How much more has she got? How much more life has she got?" And we tend to personify things. And why do we do that? Why do we objectify things? Well, I think one of the reasons why is because we need this sense in which we have a bit of control over it. Moses, when he met God the first time, remember what he did? He said, Who are you? Who am I talking to? Who are you? What are you? And what did God say? "I am what I am." Made me think of Popeye, and that's all I am. No, that's not what God says. God says, "I am what I am," but then God says, "You will know me by what I do." Isn't that interesting? You will know me by what I do. But still, there's this need to name. So I want to share with you maybe 2 quick stories. One is this one that was written by called "An Invisible Thread" by a woman named Laura Schroff. Some of you have read this book. Some of you, I think there was even a movie that came out about this. Laura Schroff was an executive, New York, a magazine executive and a marketing executive, and she had designed like Teen Magazine and a bunch of other very successful magazines. And when she was 37, already towards the pinnacle of her career, so to speak, she was rushing off to a meeting in New York, and as she came across Broadway, she was just getting to the intersection when an 11-year-old boy named Maurice had held out his hand and said, "Can I have some money?" He said, "I'm hungry, can I have some money?" And she just blew past him. And she said something happened when she got in the middle of Broadway. She came to a complete stop. Cars screeched to a halt and started honking their horn because she had actually walked into a don't walk crosswalk. And she turned around. Something started to tug at her. Something deep said, "Go back." And what did he say? And then she remembered. He said, "I'm hungry." And she couldn't turn that down. So she went back and she gave him some money, and that began a relationship that's lasted 30 years. And the book, which came out 2 years ago, highlights sort of that relationship from beginning to end. But what she says at one point later in the book is she says, "There was some common thread that connected us, but I had no idea that thread was there. I had no idea because to him, he was a panhandler on the street. And not even a panhandler. I hardly noticed he was even there. He wasn't in my object relations field." She said, "I just kept walking. But he yelled something, 'I'm hungry.' And maybe I was hungry at that moment. Or maybe something else was catching my attention," she said. "But I turned back around and it began to open up this thread that was there. And then he did something that I hadn't expected." She said, "I thought perhaps he was my angel as I look back on our relationship. He was that thread of God that sort of connected me to the bigger picture." She said, "But then I realized he saw me as that angel. Because what he had said was, 'I'm hungry,' but that wasn't what caught our relationship. He said, would you join me for lunch? And so I bought him lunch, and we had lunch that Monday, and then we had lunch every Monday after that, and to this very day for every time I'm in town. And so the book chronicles that whole relationship. But she also begins to suggest, what is it about our lives that we fail to recognize as she calls it the angelic thread. You could call it the Holy Spirit. You could call it the ground of our being. But what is it that we tend to objectify that allows us or forces us, or we unconsciously overlook the thread that's there because of how we relate to objects? And the danger, of course, is that we don't just relate to objects, then we relate to people that way, right? We label people. We label experiences. We label tribes. We label communities. Because, again, it helps us to control things. It helps us to keep kind of our thumb on things. The challenge, of course, is to open it up and to try to see that there may be much more than me or my perspective or my ego involved in this world. But that makes it more difficult because it does make it larger. Some of you remember this story I told some time back. The story of I'm going to forget his name, so I want to make sure I get the name right. Michael Weiser. Some of you probably have seen this. It's famous. It's internationally famous. The rabbi and the KKK dragon. Some of you all remember that story? I'll remind you, Rabbi Weiser, a New York rabbi, moved to Nebraska. A family was there, and he moved there and was part of the small synagogue. Immediately, within a week, he was getting calls from the local KKK dragon, a man by the name of Larry Trapp. And the calls were left on his message, "You're not welcome here. You don't need to be here. Just take your religion and go back. No Jews welcome." And these calls were coming often, to finally the point that Rabbi Weiser decided he needed to do something. So he started calling Larry Trapp. And oftentimes Larry Trapp wouldn't answer, just be an information. If you want to join the KKK, if you're not happy with the way things are, neither are we. Come talk to us, give us your name and information. And all that Rabbi Weissman would say, or Weiser, he would say, "Larry, why are you doing this? You seem really angry. There's so much love. Why do you keep doing this?" And he kept leaving those messages, and then he'd get responses that would say, "Stop calling me. Stop bothering me. You need to leave." And so finally what he started doing was he started calling, and he said, "Larry, I noticed from friends and what I've read about you that you're handicapped, your mobility impaired." And he'd lost his legs because of diabetes. He said, "I'm happy to give you transportation to a grocery store if you need to buy food, or to give you transportation anywhere. Let me know, Larry, if I can help you." And so he kept doing this for weeks and weeks, until finally he got a call, and he answered it, and it was Larry Trapp. And Larry said, "I need to get out of this. How do I get out of this?" And Rabbi Weiser said, "Do you want me to come over and talk?" And he said, "Yes." After months and months and months of hateful calls and voicemails and his invitations back and forth, finally he's getting an invitation to come over to his house, to Larry's house, and have dinner. And his son looks at him and says, "Dad, you're a Jew. He's KK. He doesn't mean come over for dinner. He means it literally. You can't go over there. He's going to eat you alive." And Rabbi Weiser said, "I'm going to go buy some chicken and some cornbread, and I'm going to go over and we're just going to break bread and see what happens." But just because he was a little bit anxious, he took a friend with him who happened to be a very tall black man, and he took him over with him. And the two of them met with Larry Trapp. And when they came in the front door, as the story goes, Larry was in his wheelchair with a pistol in his lap, a shotgun strapped across one of the arms of the chair, and then his hands kind of folded on top of the pistol, and he just started crying. And so they came in and they sat down with him. And they had a long conversation and they broke bread. And the short end of the story is that over time, He helped Larry sort of deconstruct his reality and his history. And through simple kindness, through simple acts of kindness and open possibilities of connection, Larry began to realize the world was bigger than his fear, was bigger than his walls. And he began to open up even more. And even denounced his own relationship with the KKK publicly. But in time, that alienated him from all of his former friends, and so the rabbi's wife literally invited him to move in with them. And after a few months of living with the rabbi and his wife, Larry decided he wanted to convert to Judaism. And the rabbi tells a story how he sat there and said, yeah, you don't want to be a Jew, just be a Christian. You're Catholic, just go back to church. Just remain a Christian. And he says, no, I want to be a Jew. You are the ones who reached out to me. You're the ones who opened the door to me, who helped me see the world is bigger than where I was. You helped me get from where I was to somewhere completely new. I want to convert to Judaism. And so he did eventually convert to Judaism and lived out his final days in a relationship, much like Maurice and Lori lived out his relationship with the rabbi and his wife until his death. And a huge crowd had showed up, a different crowd, but a new and wider crowd had showed up for his funeral. I was recently traveling from Dallas back to Fort Worth, and I came over a bridge. A band, you guys can come on up. I'm going to lead you right into this in just a second. But I was going over a bridge, and I was thinking about this idea of how Holy Spirit is not so much a thing, but as long as we can keep it a thing, we can keep it at bay. We can use it for when we need it, like for our belief system, or for our creed system, or for how we think our tribe thinks, right? Or how our church thinks of the Holy Spirit, what it means. As long as we can objectify it, we can keep it in its place. But I want to suggest to you that the Holy Spirit is a reality. It is a way of being in the world. That when we participate in God, when we participate in Spirit, we're doing what Martin Buber, the Jewish theologian, said. We are revealing the sacredness that is between us because we become bridges. We become bridges. But here's the interesting thing about a bridge, right? I was traveling over the bridge and I was thinking, where's this bridge taking me? I'm always thinking of the end point. That's not where the bridge is taking me. The bridge is simply spanning an obstacle, spanning a wall, spanning a gap, just in allowing for me to get over that so that opportunities open, so that life is bigger on the other side. Being a bridge is not so that I can convince you that you need to be somewhere or that we can finally agree on something. Being a bridge is simply being an openness, is simply creating an opportunity for openness to happen, for possibilities. Real delight comes from those moments of unexpected joy because we simply participated in that moment expecting something else. But not exactly what that would be, but being present enough and open enough to it that something might happen, that we might learn from a panhandler on the street, that the KKK and a Jew might actually come together in a way no one expected at all. How can we participate in this idea of bridging? Well, first of all, think about someone in your own life that has made life bigger for you. And think about it long enough that you remember just what that openness offered you at a time when it moved you from a place of fixed understanding, of fixed opinions, and suddenly opened up this possibility that the world was larger. How do we do that for one another? That's what it means to be Spirit in the world. That's what it means to participate in building bridges. Band.